Let me begin by thanking the International Christian Maritime Association for inviting me to this training and immersion course. As president of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, I found it hard to turn down your invitation, especially when I learned that this is an important international gathering of people like you who work as chaplains and attend to the spiritual and pastoral care of seafarers, more than 20% of whom are Filipinos. I find it heartwarming that you would spend a whole week together from different parts of the world, mainly to learn how to minister more effectively to seafarers, fishers, and their dependents as ICMA chaplains. I also appreciate the fact that you make yourselves available to all of them, regardless of nationality, religion, culture, gender, or ethnic origin. You surely have heard that this is precisely the kind of orientation that Pope Francis is promoting among Roman Catholics all over the world through his advocacy for what he calls a greater synodality in the church. I'm sure you've heard of the term. It's a bit controversial. They say he's rocking the boat, he's rocking the church with synodality. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which he addresses to all people of goodwill, not only to Roman Catholics, he refers to this as the promotion of solidarity and social friendship. Well, this is also the kind of orientation that seafarers themselves gradually imbibe as they encounter their fellow seafarers from different parts of the world. Well, I am sure you realize as they travel through the seas that the world is indeed round. I'm sure they realize this, especially the Filipino seafarers. In Tagalog, we have an expression. We say, bilog ang mundo. Can you say that, please? Okay, bilog ang mundo. That means the world is round. The world is round. Meaning, in whichever way you go, you will bump on your fellow human beings. You cannot run away from your fellow human beings. That wherever they embark from and disembark at, they are bound to meet other seafaring people like themselves who, for love of their own families, find themselves getting separated from them for long periods of time, having to suffer homesickness and face all kinds of odds and challenges while at sea, including the possibility of getting attacked by pirates and not being able to see their loved ones anymore. Well, the seafaring worldview is presupposed by the expression, we're in the same boat. It's a familiar English expression, we're in the same boat. I think that presupposes a kind of seafaring worldview. Whatever their nationality, religion, culture, gender, or ethnic origin might be, they realize that deep, deep within, people are basically the same. That they are bound to encounter, even in those who are very different from them, in many ways, new friends, and brothers, and sisters, and mothers, and fathers, and uncles, and aunts. Pope Francis calls it enlarging the spaces of our tents. Enlarge the space of your tents. He is quoting this from Isaiah chapter 54, verse 2. It's supposed to represent the spirit of synodality, to learn to make space for one another. You know, if you're scripture readers, you are familiar with John chapter 14, where Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Have faith in God. Have faith in me. In my Father's house, there are many rooms. There is a lot of space. God can make space for all of us, for everyone. And He expects us to be able to do the same, to make space for all. He is, well, Pope Francis is challenging Roman Catholics in particular to take the original meaning of Catholicity more seriously. Catholic has nothing to do with being sectarian or exclusive because it, its literal meaning is universality. Universality. God is God of the whole world. And inclusivity, never about sectarianism. So a very sectarian Catholic is not being a true Catholic. So he challenges us to take Catholicity seriously. Well, this is the Pope who has consistently called on Catholics to rise above the tendencies to be self-referential, to be inward-looking, or to be too churchy in our concerns. He presents Christ as our template for the God who walks with humankind as a fellow human being, ready to listen and to enter into fellowship with all people of goodwill, to engage each other in a kind of dialogue that builds friendships and spiritual communion. Okay, I'm using a term that is very, very precious to the Catholic tradition. Communion. I'm not referring to the host that we receive, the Eucharist, which indeed is also referred to as communion. But communion has to do with spiritual bond that creates community. You cannot have community without communion. Maybe you can have a collectivity. You know, you group people together, that's a collectivity. But that is not necessarily a community. It takes more than just, you know, being together in a physical location to be community. People usually confuse between a house and a home. And the late Burt Bacharach, you know, composed the song, well, it was Hal David, the music is Burt Bacharach. He says, but a chair is not a house, and a house is not a home, but the two of us are far apart, and one of us has a broken heart. So, family, home, community has to do with a network of relationship. So, for him, spiritual communion is the very foundation of community life. And one who is familiar with community life will learn to be community not just with fellow Catholics, not just with fellow Christians, not just with fellow believers, but with every fellow human being, or even every fellow resident in this planet Earth, or common home. That is why Filipino homes are very open homes, because the environment is part of the home. Even that dog or cat or that bird or the insects around, they're also part of the home. And Pope Francis loves that. You know, he wrote, Laudato Si, the earth is our common home. Well, Pope Francis calls communion as the most fundamental element of synodality. That's a value he has been promoting in not just the church, but in all people of goodwill. Synodality is, you know, from the Greek word synhodos, which simply means walking together, on the way together, traveling together, or as the case might be, you know, seafaring together, being in the same boat. Synodality. So, it is the objective of intercultural and intercontextual dialogues among people. Whether you like it or not, when people encounter each other and engage in dialogue, they bring with them their cultures, their worldview, their religion, you know, their own context. And so every dialogue is intercultural. Every dialogue is intercontextual. The facilitation of listening and the opening of minds can build a spiritual bond, a oneness of mind and heart that is the foundation of community, and which the Catholic tradition would call communion. Well, two other elements are born out of that spiritual bonding, which we call communion. And these are participation and a shared sense of mission. Two other elements born out of communion. Well, people who are capable of intercultural dialogue are eventually also capable of transcending their culture. And I call that transculturation. Transcending one's own culture. Like you are doing now, when you eat Filipino food, if you happen to be in the Philippines, you cannot say, I'll eat only my food. And I cannot tolerate any other kind of food than my food. Okay, you can starve to death for all I care. You cannot transculturate. Transculturating is to taste Chinese food, Japanese food, Filipino food, and you say, it's food also. It's nourishing too. And learn to actually appreciate it. It's like you are educating your palates. And you're saying, wow, this is a new exposure. Well, transculturation enables one to see in the people of other faiths and ethnicities a neighbor, or better yet, a brother or a sister. That we are actually interconnected with each other. We are. In Tagalog, we have a saying. It says, ang sakit ng kalingkingan ay ramdam ng buong katawan. In English, the pain of a part of the body is felt by the whole body. Even if you say, I have a headache, it's actually your whole being that aches when your head is throbbing. The pain of one part is the pain of the whole. That recognition of interconnectedness is what promotes the other two elements of synodality, which are participation and mission. Participation and mission. Well, normally Christians would think of mission as evangelizing, but it's not only Christians who have a sense of mission. We can bond with other people of other faiths and develop a common sense of mission about, promoting a healthy environment, promoting human rights, promoting justice. It doesn't have to be about your religion. I am inclined to think that the main reason why 20% or 1.65 million as of 2015, I do not know if the figures have changed already because that's 8 years ago now. I'm reading this from the result of a research work done in 2021, that 20% or 1.65 million of all seafarers or merchant mariners around the world are Filipinos. Is the fact that we are really a nation of seafarers ourselves. The Filipinos are a nation of seafarers. Our country is made up of more than 7,000 islands. How many islands have you visited so far? Only one? If you have been only to Manila, you haven't been to the Philippines yet. You have to visit at least 100 of 7,000 islands. Well, you go to Pangasinan and right there you'll see 100 islands. You can hop from island to island. You might want to buy one island. I do not know if they'll allow you to. You can occupy one island and spend a whole day in one island. And we have lots of them. Well, islands appear and disappear. And don't ask me exactly how many islands there are in the Philippines, because as one beauty contestant once answered when she was asked how many islands there are in the Philippines, her reply was high tide, low tide. There's a difference, because islands appear and disappear in this country. Well, we are therefore called the doorway to Asia through the Pacific. That's the reason why we are a seafaring people. We are also made up of diverse cultures. If you call me Filipino, well, just a bit more than 100 years ago, that didn't mean anything because that animal did not exist about 150 years ago. It's a new identity. You ask me, what are you? I'd say I'm Kapampangan. I belong to the ethnic group called Pampangueños. People think all Filipinos speak Tagalog. That's not true. Well, that's a national language. But, I grew up speaking my own mother language, native language, which is Kapampangan, Pampango. And take note, I take offense when people say it's a dialect. No, it is not. It has its own grammatical structure. It has its own vocabulary. We're proud Kapampangans. Just as some of you Filipinos here are proud Ilonggos, Ilocanos, Cebuanos. Non-Filipinos would not know the difference. We are a very diverse people. But, thanks be to God, we have a common identity we call Filipino. So, we come from diverse cultures, languages, and ethnicities, right, among ourselves. And that explains our sense of, openness to people who seem to be other, because we are also other to one another anyway. The national identity called Filipino only was born after the revolution against Spain, when we finally kicked out the Spanish colonial masters from these islands. We welcomed them as guests, but they felt so comfortable, they declared that these islands belonged to them and called them the Philippines after King Philip, But when we got rid of them, we appropriated for ourselves the term Filipino, which did not refer to the natives. The natives before in this country were simply called Indios. The ignorant Spaniards did not know that these people are not from India. Well, I think it was actually Christopher Columbus, who mistook the Indians of India for the Indians of America, and used the same word, Indio. So it's a term that we were collectively
used to dealing with foreign seafarers, like themselves, like them, because they had a traumatic experience. Magellan had a trauma with Marianas Islands, Guam. Before they arrived, before they reached the Philippines, they passed through Guam. And they were attacked by the Chamorros of Guam. And, they were met by pirates who stole from them. And so they were so afraid. As soon as they entered our islands in the Visayas, they were holding on to their weapons. Because they had been attacked previously, they were very, very cautious. When they landed in Homonhon Island, near Limasawa Island in the Visayas, thinking that the natives of these islands might be savages. Oh, the poor Magellan, he thought we were savages. And so they were very nervous, very, very nervous, before they first landed ashore on March 16, 1521. They were holding on to their weapons as their ships entered the Visayan Islands. But when they succeeded in explaining with the aid of an interpreter named Enrique, a Malay slave from Malacca in Malaysia, when they explained that they had come from very far away and that they had suffered for many, many days of traveling through the vast ocean that would later be called the Pacific, they were welcomed by the natives of these islands. Well, all they needed was to explain that they were just passing through, that their destination ultimately was the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands, which is now part of East Indonesia. They did not strike the natives at all as invaders who were about to attack them. It's amazing that the natives didn't feel like defending themselves from these foreigners, these seafarers. And of course, they explained that they had left their port of origin as 5 galleons, but only 3 succeeded in arriving these islands, very badly damaged and very much in need of repair. Well, they needed to take care of their sick crew members and bury several of their companions who did not survive the journey. They were also very badly in need of food and water and were willing to buy these or to trade them with goods. Now, what did the natives see in these foreign seafarers? Not invaders, but simply fellow human beings in need of help. Fellow human beings in need of help. In Filipino culture, if you come as a stranger and you wish to enter a home, don't just enter. You need to knock at the door and say something. Identify yourself as a human being. What do we say when we knock at the door? We say, "Tao po." Can you repeat that? Tao po. That's what you say when you knock at a Filipino house. Tao po. You know what it means? A human being here. A human being here. That's enough. Behave like a human. That's enough. You're going to be welcome. It is our way of assuring people, well, that we do not mean harm. I'm a human being. And, you know, the term that we use in Filipino is pagpapakatao. Pagpapakatao. And it means behaving like a human being, not like an animal. We distinguish between pagpapakatao and pagpapakahayop. That's behaving like an animal. If you behave like an animal, you'll be treated like one. But if you behave like a proper human being, you'll be treated well. And it is our way of assuring people that we do not mean harm. Pagpapakatao and pakikipagkapwa-tao. Meaning relating as human beings to fellow human beings. Kapwa-tao, a fellow human. Aside from helping their foreign guests to care for the sick companions and bury their dead, the natives even helped them build a platform on which the guests could worship their God. Can you imagine that? The natives of this country, they were believers themselves, but their guests wanted to come up with an act of worship, and they needed a platform on which to celebrate the Mass. They had no problem. They built a platform for them and even joined them in that act of worship. It was really a story of friendship that later unfortunately turned sour the moment Magellan began to shift his behavior from that of a friend to that of a patron to his hosts. It started when he began to claim the special privilege of being allowed to dock in the port of Cebu, one of the major islands in the central Philippines, without paying the required taxes. Back then, there was already a system of taxation for boats or ships that were docking in the port of Cebu. Now, Magellan said, maybe you can waive the taxes for me because we're friends, you know. And Raja Humabon, well, gave in spite of the fact that the rest of the other seafarers had to pay taxes. The Indians did, the Chinese and the other Asian seafarers. In short, the friendly dealings began to shift to a political transaction the moment Magellan began to assume a more political role. Well, that's another story altogether. You can read it in our history books. Now let me shift to your concern about providing spiritual and pastoral care for Filipino seafarers, fishers, and their families. This will not take very long. My only exposure to the pastoral care for seafarers was during those years that I spent in Belgium as a student for my licentiate and doctorate studies in the Catholic University of Leuven, or Louvain for some Americans. During those years, I was invited occasionally by a good friend of mine whom some of you probably know, Andre Quintilier. Has anyone? You know him? Okay, good. I will tell Andre. I've met some of you. He used to be the Catholic chaplain of the Stella Maris Center in Ghent, Belgium, until his retirement. That's quite a long time. That experience, gave me an idea what sort of ministry you yourselves are engaged in as chaplains of seafarers. If you Google the website of Stella Maris in Ghent, you are immediately welcomed by a post that says, near the border of the harbor and the beautiful city of Ghent, you can find a place to warm your feet, taste one of our many Belgian beers, or drink a hot tea or a warm chocolate milk. Find a friend to talk to, play a game of pool or ping pong, or just sit quietly chatting to the family back home. I remember how Father Andre casually greeted the Filipinos who were enjoying themselves at the center, drank beer with them, and made them feel at home by telling them about his many years of experience as a guest professor in the Philippines, the few Tagalog words that he could speak, and his familiarity with gestures, Filipino gestures like mano po. When you enter a home, some people will kiss your hand. Well, not exactly kiss your hand. Take your hand and press it on their forehead. That's asking for your blessing. Mano po. Believe it or not, Filipinos were doing it even before the Spaniards came, because Pigafetta was already remarking how respectful these people were. They were taking his hand and pressing it on their forehead. So it's actually Filipino. Well, it is Asian because they also do it in Malaysia, apparently in Indonesia. Or another gesture, when you walk between two people who are engaged in a conversation, you don't just walk right through. That's very disrespectful because they're connecting with each other. So what you do is this. Excuse me. Because you're crossing a line. It's very impolite to just walk right through. Or you can point at things with your lips. That means you know Filipinos. You say, where is my ball pen? It doesn't mean he wants to kiss you, He's pointing at something. Or the basic warm smile, a nod of the head, and a simple, kumusta ka? Kumusta? Which is actually Spanish, ¿cómo está? ¿Cómo está? How are you? Well, there was no internet yet back then, but we knew, he knew well enough, Andre knew well enough that the immediate concern of every Filipino seafarer was to find a way of getting in touch with his family. And so what he did was he made it easy for them, upon entering the center, to immediately find out where to get a telephone card, how to use it. They say in Africa, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that is just as true for Filipinos, not just for Africans. Perhaps if it were only possible to dissect a Filipino soul, what you will find inside is not an individual, but a whole web of relationships with family, with friends, and many other significant people in our lives. This, I think, is one of the most important things to consider in the care for the mental and spiritual health of Filipino seafarers. It is important, above all, to know the answers to questions that are very basic to every Filipino. Like questions like, what gives meaning to your life? Anong kahulugan ng buhay mo? Anong nagbibigay kahulugan? What gives meaning? And meaning in Filipino is kahulugan. And you know what it means? It literally means something to fall into. Anong nagbibigay kahulugan? What gives meaning to your life is literally asking, what do you fall into? Something to fall into. From the root word hulog, which means to fall. Not the negative, but the positive sense of falling. As in, falling in love. Or falling into place. Or falling back again. The image makes you imagine a bucket which water can fall into, a container that collects the water and saves it from getting wasted. Filipinos know that many lives are wasted, and the Filipino term for a wasted life is nagkakalat. Nagkakalat. Literal meaning is making a mess. Making a mess. Meaning going through a state of chaos or dispersal. A life without a sense of direction or mission. Feeling scattered. There is nothing that collects or gathers you together as a human being. Nothing can be more awful than that for a Filipino. Nagkakalat, messing up. And so the other important question for a Filipino is, what is your life's purpose? What is your life's purpose? And the word is layunin. Anong layunin mo sa buhay? Layunin can mean objective, goal, or mission. It is related to the question, what keeps you going? What do you live for? What do you earn money for? What are you willing to die for? And these for us are fundamental life questions. The typical Filipino seafarer wants to work very hard and earn a decent amount to be able to support family and loved ones back home. Doing this makes him very happy, fulfilled, and dignified. How the Filipino soul is wired, and by the way, we nickname ourselves as Pinoy. Filipino, Pinoy. How the Pinoy soul is wired is something that a sensitive chaplain should find very easy to understand. The biggest struggle for any seafarer is loneliness. And that goes not only for Filipinos, but for any seafarer. Loneliness, homesickness, and a feeling of alienation. There was a study done entitled The Mental Health of Filipino Seafarers and Its Implications for Seafarers' Education, done for the International Maritime Health Review. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this publication. I checked out the list of odds considered by Filipino seafarers as most challenging about their work. Here they are. Long-term separation from home, fatigue, work intensification, multinational crewing, social isolation, ill treatment, poor life-work balance, job insecurity, criminalization of seafarers' activities, working in constrained space, bullying, piracy, lack of shore leave, short port stays, HIV/AIDS, psychosocial, and psychophysical stress. To cope with loneliness, Filipinos have a great tendency to resort to social life in order to find a support system or a place they can go to where activities can take place. And you know what we call them? Tambayan. You ask a Filipino, saan ang tambayan mo? Where is your tambayan? It comes from the word tambay. And it is actually English. Stand by. The origin of the word tambay is stand by. Where do you stand by? The place where you go to where activities take place and where you can just stand by. They don't immediately participate. At the start, they're just observing. They will stand by from a distance. In the age of digital technology, it has become much easier for them, of course, to get in touch with their loved ones. And so it is not unusual that the very first thing that a Filipino will want to invest in is a good smartphone or a good tablet and a good internet connection, whether through Wi-Fi or cellular data, in order to be able to reach loved ones. And the common negative consequence of this, however, is the tendency for them to get hooked on social media. Social media. You see, social media can cause people to become very antisocial or asocial. You know that because we're vulnerable to it ourselves. I would suggest that, that venues be created not just for personal social media time, but also for what I call social media. That's not a mistake. It's double. It's social media, because social media is not always social. So how do you socialize social media, which tends to make people very individualistic? Well, I'll just give examples of good opportunities that can be both socially interactive, physically and virtually. You might want to facilitate some group dynamics in which you can ask Filipinos, like share a YouTube video of a comfort food that you crave from home and how you prepare it. Even better, to prepare it actually and give it to others or share it with others. Share a video of religious practices that you find meaningful. Share a video of a native song that means a lot to you and why. What is it saying? Share a video of places in your country that you find most beautiful and which you wish you can show to your non-Filipino friends when they get to visit your country. Share a video of a native song. Share how you pray, how you worship, how you read your scriptures and reflect on them, whether it be the Bible or the Quran or any scriptures. Share how you celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, honor the dead, propose marriage, etc. at home. Build interest groups around skills training like cooking, gardening, animal raising, entrepreneurship, managing resources, budgeting, basic accounting, saving and investing money, learning languages, etc. Well, let me now wind up. I'm going over time already, just 2 short paragraphs. Pope Francis has one very simple and practical tip for people involved in what we call pastoral care. Since pastoring has to do with shepherding, he says, well, it's important to know where they're coming from. There are some missing slides. Pope Francis says, good shepherds have to smell like their sheep. You're familiar with that. Good shepherd must smell like their sheep. And for that to happen, they have to learn to really immerse with them, to listen to their stories, to laugh, to cry, and to celebrate with them. The shepherding metaphor, however, has limitations too. Remember, seafarers are people, not sheep. They are people. They are not to be treated like a mindless herd of flock who will just follow whatever the shepherd will tell them. They have their own minds too, their own life stories, their own reasons for thinking, reasoning, behaving, deciding the way they do. And to understand them, it is important to know where they are coming from. Oh, there it is. Yeah, important to know where they're coming from. Thank you for your attention.